Hi, Startup 260. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to take our existing Simon application, which is built on HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We added services to it. We put a database behind it. We added authentication into it, and then finally WebSockets. And now we want to convert it to a modern web application framework, namely React. So to do that, I'm going to create a template React application, and I'm going to bring up my Simon WebSockets current repository, and I'm going to meld those two together and then convert all of my code over into a React representation using components. So let's start off by coming over here, and we're going to create a template React application. So to do that, we're going to use npx to execute create React app, and we're going to give it a name for the application that we want to actually use, which is called React template. So I'm going to start that up. That takes a while to run, and so while that's happening, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do Control R to bring up my history of a git clone to just pull down the WebSockets repository, and I'm just going to put it in a directory called Simon. Then that's where I'm going to actually do all my changes. So I'm going to pull that down at the same time. And that should happen pretty quickly. Whoop, sorry, must already exist. And sure enough it does, so let's go ahead and remove that. Once that's done, I can go back and do my clone. And that pulls it down. So now I've got both. I've got my so if I do a directory here, I've got my React template created, and I've also got my WebSocket version of Simon in that directory. And now I can go and actually view both of these. So let's start with the template application. Change directory. I'm going to change directory into my React template, and now open it up with code and resize it once again. So here I can see my basic React template. So it's got my package JSON, which imports all of those dependencies that it has. It's got all the React ones, and then it's got some extra testing ones and the Web Vital ones, which I'll remove here in a minute. And then you've got your source directory, which just has your components for your React application. And then you've got your public directory, which has your template stuff to actually run. So before I actually execute this, I'm going to clean it up to get rid of some stuff which is good, like the Web Vitals, which tracks statistics for your application, and also the testing stuff, which is also good. But I want to just simplify this as much as possible so we can focus on what the essentials are and also what we need to do in order to bring our Simon code into this environment. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to uninstall some of those packages. So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to change over to use a terminal shell here, and I'm going to use npm uninstall to remove something like Web Vitals, for example. So I can just run that, and it will pull out all that third-party code, and you can see that I've removed it from my package. I can go over into my code where that was referenced here in the index.js file and pull that out so that that's no longer there. Let's make this code just a little bit bigger so you can see a little bit better. And then I'm going to pull this out there. That was the reference to it. And now I've completely removed, after I delete this file, which was the display of the Web Vitals, everything that was being used by that. If I go back to my package JSON again, and then I've got these three files here. So I want to delete those. So I can do a similar thing. I'm just going to paste that in down here to remove all the testing ones. So I'm doing npm uninstall on those three packages. You can do them on the same line. It knows to act on each one of those individually. So it's going to pull that apart. I'm going to execute that, and that should remove all of that testing. And then I can go and delete the testing files, so that test, and then the app JSON, and we're good to go. I think that's everything. So with those all deleted, I can actually execute it. If we go look at our package JSON, and I'll pull this out here since we got rid of the test. And I've got two scripts in my npm package JSON file. One to start up the application in a debugging way, such that it's creating a hot reloading HTTP server to load up my code that also gets bundled as I run this into a temporary directory, and it's loading from that. So whenever you make a change to it, it rebundles it again, puts it in that temp directory, and then uses the hot reloading HTTP server to display within the browser. So that's what that one's doing. And then build just builds a static representation of my code, converting all my JSX and minifying it and bundling it and transpiling all the files into a version that the browser can actually represent, and puts it into a directory for distribution. So that's used when you deploy, but this one's used when you're actually developing and debugging in your development environment. So I can start that up by doing npm start. And that's going to launch, build up all that code, it's launching it, and you can see the application actually running there on port 3000. So I know everything works, and we're good here. So I'm just going to save those changes. I don't care about anything else here. I'm just going to, well, let's go ahead and rename this here so that our file actually is Simon instead of that. And we're good to go. So now I've got my template React application all up and running. So the next thing that I want to do is actually prep my Simon version so that it is the way I want it to be. So if I change directory here into the Simon WebSocket code that I downloaded, open that up in VS Code, and I'm going to put that right here. We're going to pull this one over a little bit to get it out of the way, and we'll put that right there. So now if I look at this code, this is exactly what it was for the Simon WebSocket. So I've got my service code out here in the root of the project, and I've got all my front end code here in the public directory that the Express web server loads up whenever it gets a request for a static file from that public directory. So that's standardly how it's set up with just Node.js to be able to host that front end static code. Now, because I'm going to be injecting all that React front-end code in there that I just created over in my template, I want to be a little more careful about how I set up this directory structure. So I'm going to create a folder called service, and I'm going to move all that service code in there so that the React code can actually control the main directory of the project. And then I'm just going to pull in my database, I'm going to pull in my index, I'm going to pull in my proxy, and also the package JSON file, because this is specific to loading all the required dependencies for my service. And I'm just going to drag those right up in here into my service directory. The deploy service script is going to be different for React because it has to run the command to do all the bundling. So I'm going to delete that out of there. And my package lock is once again relative to the service, so I'm going to kill that too, and I'll just recreate it up in this directory. So from there, I can actually open up a little terminal window in here, and I can change directory into my service directory. And I can actually run npm install here, and that's going to use this package JSON file here to actually load up all the dependencies. So these are all my backend service dependencies. And so I'm going to have two copies of Node modules, one for the backend service in this directory, and then once I bring over the front end code, there's going to be another Node modules at the top level, which handles all the React front end code. So let's go ahead and install that. And I should get a Node modules appearing in here in a second. As soon as all that gets pulled in, you can see there it is, and I've got my new package lock file based upon whatever settings I had in here, and I've got everything imported in. So I can actually, from this directory, now that I've got all that code there, I can actually do like node index.js and just run my service. And I can demonstrate that that's working by going back over to my console window here, and I'll just do like curl localhost, and I've got API user test. So this is an API that's actually within my code. If I go over here to index.js, scroll down here, you can see I've got this endpoint. So if I do my curl on that, this time I get the right result. Yeah, so I get our authentication and the username back from that. So I can see that that's actually working. And I can actually do debugging in here too. So I can kill it from running just from the console terminal. And I can put a breakpoint like right here, and I can run debugging from here. So if I push F5 on this file, it's going to say, hey, what execution program do you want to use? And I want to use Node.js, so that's going to launch it. You can see that it did the same thing. It's running Node on index.js, and it's listed on port 3000. So if I come here and make that same request again, this time it's going to break on it because I set that breakpoint before it returns it. But if I take off my breakpoint and push F5, you can see that that result also came back from there. So I also want to come here while I've got this going, and I want to add a configuration so that we have a node configuration that automatically runs service index.js. So now I don't have to specify which thing I'm executing every time I run. I can just make it so that every time I run F5, it's just going to reference this configuration here. So I can push stop. That file is saved. It gets saved over here in the VS Code area if I ever want to go back and change what this actually is. But now I can be on any file. I can be on like pure proxy and push F5, and that's going to launch the index.js because it's using that configuration to actually launch. Okay, So now we're all set. We've got our back-end code moved over into the service. The next thing that I want to do is we're going to basically move all of our front-end code over to a React representation. And if you remember, the React one also has a public directory which has its front-end stuff. So I don't want those two to conflict. So I'm going to rename this one here to be old public, and I'll pull things from that to put into our new public. Okay, and I think that's everything that I needed to do there to get our code base prepped in order to bring React over. Now I just want to yank it over. So we're at a good milestone here before I bring in the React code to actually do a commit on my code here. So I can come over here and see all the moving around of files, look at each one of these changes individually, make sure I'm happy with them, and I could actually do a code commit here. So if something goes wrong as I bring the React stuff over, I can just pull that over rather than have to clean all my code up again. So I won't actually do the commit at this point, but that's something that you should be doing throughout this entire process. All right, so our next step is to actually start bringing stuff over. So I can come over here and I can grab this source directory, which is all of the React components, and just drag her right over into my my Simon directory. I'm going to copy the whole folder. I also want to bring the public folder over, so I can bring that one over and copy the entire folder. I need the package.json because this represents all of the files and dependencies that are necessary to run our React app, so I'm going to bring that one over. And I believe that should probably be everything. So at this point, we're stop debugging. I've got everything running here nicely. So I should be able to actually then come here to our console window once again. So if I go to the terminal, and instead of running the backend service, I'm going to change directories back into the root here. And I should be able to do npm install to bring over all the package requirements, and that's going to take a little bit of time. But while I'm talking about that, I can look really quickly and make sure I'm happy. So I've got all my old front-end code here. I've got my new templates, static files that React created for me automatically there. I've got my service in the service directory, which is nice. And I've got my news source, so these are my component files over here in this directory. Okay, so that I'm finished installing, so now I've got a new node modules, but this is for my front-end code, not to be confused with the service node modules, which is for my back-end code. And I should be able to just come here and do npm start, and that should actually bring up, once again, React, but this time I'm running it from my Simon project instead of from the one that was used previously. So we're good there. I can actually show that this is working if I come to the source directory, and you've got all your basic files here. So you've got your index, which is acting upon, it's selecting from our HTML to grab that root ID and then inject our first top level React component or app component into there. And if we go look at the public source here, we can see our index.html, and this is the one that React gave us. Now, it's got some stuff in here, but the one thing that I wanted to point out right now is that there is that index.div with an ID of root, and that's where we're injecting the data into. I'm going to clean this file up a little bit, get rid of all these comments. Nice. And I'm going to actually change the title to not be React App anymore, but I'm going to change it to be, Simon. And there's a reference to the manifest. These are all going to be dynamically changed when it bundles it up, runs it through your tool chain to actually be the right things. But they're decent for right now. I've got the React icon, which I don't want, so I don't want to replace that with the Simon one. Which do I have a Simon one over? Let's go look in our old public and in our assets. Yeah, I don't have one in. No, it's right there. There it is. Ta-da! So I'm going to drag this down and replace that one right there. So now I'm going to be displaying the Simon icon rather than the React one. I like that. I'll leave the other ones there. We could replace these with versions, and the manifest file is just for public. I'm sorry, for progressive web apps. So we're not going to really use that, but I'm just going to leave that there for right now. Okay, so if I come back to my index.js, I'm going to find that in my index.html, and I'm going to replace it with this React app. And that React app is being loaded from this directory right here. So if I come over here and look at this, I can actually take this component and just whack the whole thing. And instead of returning what it was doing, I can come in here and I can put Simon in here. So this is my first change to actually make it. You can see I'm getting some warnings, and that's really nice. It's going to help me in my environment to know when things aren't needed. I deleted the logo out of there, so that's not needed anymore, so I can just remove that, and now I don't get any more warnings. If I toggle over to my application here, now I've done my first step to turn my Simon app to make it a full React application. Not a big step, but a really exciting one. We should probably celebrate at this point. Go get a drink. Maybe I'll do that. So that we can then check into our GitHub repository that we've made this step. All right, our next step is we pulled everything over that we want from it, so we can get rid of this React template. Just pull that off. We'll slide our code over and make it a little bit bigger. Maybe make the size a little bit bigger so you can see that more fully what's going on there. And I go do a commit, like I just mentioned. We'll save that. Everything's good. The next step is I want to be able to use Bootstrap within this. So I need to have a couple of the dependencies which I didn't have before. So I'm going to stop my running, and I'm going to do, first of all, an npm install, and I'm going to install Bootstrap. So this is going to bring over all of those CSS files necessary to make all my components run right. And I'm also going to install another package too called React Bootstrap, which basically takes a lot of the Bootstrap components and wraps them, all the Bootstrap widgets, and wraps them in a React component representation of it. So I can actually use like a button React component rather than using like the standard HTML components. So I'm going to go ahead and install both of those. If I come over to my package.json, you'll see that those both got injected in there. So I've got that in there, and I'll use that later on also. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go to our app, and instead of just having a simple Simon representation here, I actually want to pull in some of my code. And probably the easiest way to do that is to go to my old public directory and look at my play.html code. Here I've got for each one of my views in my old app, I have a different HTML page which has my header all reproduced, and I've got my Bootstrap and everything referenced there. But all I really want to do is come and grab this entire body thing, which includes my navigation header, my main code for my Simon game, and then also my footer, and all the way down to that end body tag. And I'm just going to copy that entire HTML from my old code and come in here and replace my component for my application, my top level application, with that code. Now there's some things I don't want, like I don't want to bring in my JavaScript from there, and I don't want those comments. I don't even really want the main to be in here. So I'm going to pull this out and remove that, and instead I'm just going to, in the main area, I'm just going to say, body goes here. Or I like this better. Let's make it say Simon. Simon. Okay, so now I've got this header, and I've got a body, and it's giving me an error because it's doing actually some nice checking on me, so I can just pull that thing out. I don't actually want my Simon navigation to be an anchor tag anymore, so I'm just going to replace that with the div. I'm just getting rid of all the errors that it's warning me about. So I've got a body, I've got all those navigation headers here. I threw out the play component to actually play the game and just put in a placeholder, because remember, this is where we're going to inject the component representing our different functional pieces of our Simon application dynamically, just in our single web application at this point. And then you've got your footer all displayed here. So in theory, that should actually do something interesting. So let's go ahead and save that. It's still referring to our app.js, so we'll see how that actually turns out. We'll come over here to our page, and yeah, there you go. That doesn't look quite right. How about, oh yeah, sorry, we shut down our server, didn't we? So let's come back over here, and we'll do npm start to start up the hot reloading HTTP server, and in theory that should load up. Okay, there you go. So now we've got our content in here, and it doesn't look all that great. So we need to fix that. So let's go add our styling in here. You can see it's importing for this component this app CSS file. So we just want to come over here to our main CSS file, and we're going to copy everything out of here, and we're going to put it over in our app CSS and replace all that. Okay, and let's go see how that looks. So if we come here and refresh, You can see that it's doing some layout. It's actually got everything organized nicely, but the thing that we're missing is the Bootstrap styling. So I can bring that in if I come back over here, and I can use, because I imported that package already into our npm node modules, I can just reference that to pull in the actual CSS directly, rather than going and putting it like we did in the old days under index.js or HTML. We actually did an import here. This is basically the same thing, but instead of going to the CDN out to some other person's third-party server to pull those files in, I pulled them in a package, and then I'm referencing that package right here with this. So hopefully our page will look a whole lot better. So now we're actually looking pretty close to what we have. I just got a placeholder here for my components that I'm going to inject in there, but everything else looks pretty great. I'm going to make one more change here, because remember, in our static public files, we actually, if we go look at index.html, I've got a body tag here, and then I'm injecting my components into here. So my app component, if I actually am injecting another body tag, is a little weird. You'd have a body tag within a body tag. So I'm just going to convert this to a div, and then I'm going to put a class on here, which is my top level class, and then I'll go down to the bottom here. Instead of a body, I'm going to fix that and make a div. Make that a div and save that. And then if I come over to my CSS, you can see I had a styling on the body element. I'm just going to change this to be a class reference, a selector on the top element. And hopefully now if I come back over here, everything still looks the same, but I've gotten rid of that weird body representation there. Okay, so now we're good. We have everything there to actually convert our app over, at least at a top level, to be a React application. Next thing that I want to do, so this is step 2 right here. So I'm going to close up all these files, leave me in a blank space. All right, so our next step is to actually start to create placeholder components for all of our different parts of our application. So to do that, I'm going to come here into the source directory, and I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to create a folder for each one of the different main level components, so like login, and then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this one login, and I'm going to give it a JSX extension. I kind of like the JSX extensions. First of all, it'll show me in my icon that it's actually a React component rather than just a JS file. But secondly, it helps me remember what codes are actually components and what are just pure JS JavaScript files. You can do it however you want. The Babel compiler is smart enough to know what's right either way. And then I'm just going to bring in a simple empty template here. So this is my login. And all I'm doing is I'm just returning a main element, and then I'm displaying the login text is here. So if I actually save that, and then we come back over to our app.js, and where I was displaying Simon before, I can actually now just reference that that login component. And it's going to get mad at me because it doesn't actually know. Well, it should get mad at me. Oh, sorry, because I didn't give it an actual. There we go. Now it's getting mad at me because it's like, hey, I don't know what that thing is. So I need to import that. So if I just do an import, yep, and then do login, and I'm going to pull that from, and we're going to pull that from login/login, and save that. Now it's not mad anymore because it knows that it's pulling in that login component from that directory there. And if we go over to our app, you can see that it's displaying that. So login is displayed here. So I've injected my first component representing my Simon application, even though it doesn't actually have the code there. So I want to do that same thing for all my other 4 different views to it. So I'm just going to come here and copy this, and I'm going to paste it 3 more times. And then I'm going to rename this. So instead of this, it's going to be play, and then the file coming off. Oh, apparently I embedded them all within each other. Oh, that's not good. Sorry, let's paste that again. So I'm going to delete that. So I've got my play. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it here, and then I can come here again and paste it here again. So now I've got everything much better. So I've got scores, and then I've got about. So those are my 3. I also need to come in here and rename this file here. So I'm going to rename this one to about.jsx. I'm going to go into the file and change it so that it's actually about. And that we're going to say about is displayed here. And then I've already done login. We're going to go to play, rename this one to be play. and we're going to say play is displayed here, and we're going to change that to be play. Nice. And then one more, scores. So our scores component, we're going to call this scores, and we're going to say scores is displayed here. Okay, so I have 4 different components. If I go back to my app here, I've got one of them in here, but I need the other ones also. So I'm just going to paste some code in here that does that, so you don't have to watch me type. And we've got all of those actually here. This is giving me a warning because it's not actually used. That's okay. I mean, I could change this to be any of them. So play would be here. Now if we go back to our application, you'll see that play is being displayed. So what I want to do is now make it so that this can be dynamically changed based upon what they actually select when they click on these links at the top. And those links right now are just doing, you know, standard old anchor links to actually bring it over here. So I'm going to close everything up, and we'll move on to our next step, which is to actually bring the router in. So to bring the router in, we're going to open up our app.js file, and we're going to install the router package so that we can actually have those React components there. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to do npm install, and we're going to bring in React DOM router. Oops, sorry, router DOM. Okay, so that'll install that there. And if I go look at my package.json file, you'll see that it's indeed brought that in. So now I can reference all of the router functionality. And I'm going to do that right here in my app.js file by importing the components from that package that I want to use to make things actually work. So I'm going to come here, and I'm missing one, which is the browser router. So the browser router, navlink, routes, and routes, that'll do everything I need in order to make the router work. So the first thing that I need to do is wrap this whole element in a browser router. So I'm going to browser router, because that's telling it that this component now actually owns everything else within it. So it can discover links and also control where those links actually go through. So I'm going to then clean up the tag here at the bottom with our close tag on that. And now my router is actually in there. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is change over all of these anchor tags to actually use the navigation functionality. So everywhere that I've got an anchor in here, I need to make this a little bit smaller. Yeah. So everywhere that I've got an anchor in here, I'm going to change to be actually nav links instead, which will allow the browser components to actually detect when something gets clicked on and then replace the components dynamically. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a multi-select there and change this from an anchor tag to a nav link component. And then I'm going to come to the end, and I need to change these from what they are here with actually going to an HTML page, because I don't have HTML pages anymore. We just have the individual components that we need to link to, and I'm going to use the attribute which the navlink component expects to be able to oops, that one didn't quite work, got a little funky there. So let me just clean this up real fast. There you go. To actually load those component paths instead, and then I just need to clean up this anchor tag. So if I select all those and make those a navlink, so now I'm using that navlink component to do all my navigation for it, and that's great. So when you click on it, that component will detect a click, and it will change my path to be whatever the to path is. And I also want to pull this active out of here because we don't want that. That's left over from before. Okay, so now we're all good. We've got our links changed over, but we need to be able to actually do some navigations. So we need to actually now go in and add in our router portion of this. So this is where we define our routes. So I'm going to just replace this one hard-coded component with the routes functionality of the DOM router. And I've got one of them. I'm referencing this not found component. So let me cover that in a second here, but let me just show you what these other routes are. So up above, I tell when you click on it, I want to go to these things, so change my path to it. This defines how the mapping between the path and what element actually gets loaded. So when I get like just the root, it's going to bring up the login component. When I do play component, and so forth. This last one here is if I get something which isn't represented by any of the other ones, then I want to just go to this not found component. And I can just create this little simple not found component, stick it into the bottom of our code here, and say that whenever that is invoked, it's just going to display, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, not found. So now our router is defined, we have our routes defined, it's going to bring up all those just stubbed out versions of all of our components, and we actually should, if all goes well, be working right. That looks good. So about's working, score's working, play's working, but home is not working. It's going to something that's not actually there. Look, you can see it's going to index the index path. So we must have missed something up in here. Oh yeah, we actually told it to go to the index path, but we didn't define a route for the index path. So what I'm going to do instead is tell it to go to just the empty path and have that bring it over here. So now if I refresh, we go home, now it's going to the login component, the play component, scores component, and about component. Everything's great. Okay, so routing is totally working, even though it's just routing to an empty component. So we're good at this point. We can actually, we've implemented our router, and we're ready to go to start actually implementing our components and replace those stubs that are there. So I'm going to close this up, and now's a good time to come over to your history or your Git changes and do a commit, because you've reached a significant milestone. And now we'll move on to the next portion, which is to actually implement a component. Okay, now we want to bring over our first component, which is going to be our scores component. If we look at it right now, we've still just got the template code in there. If we go over and view it over in here, you can see that just like all the other components, it's just displaying that template one. So we want to bring over code that we had created before in our scores.html. So if we look at the scores.html, you can see it's got our headers and everything and our footers. None of that matters anymore because that's all handled by the app component to actually inject those, and we just care about the part of the scores HTML file that actually renders our scores text. So we grab that, and we can leave that there, and I'm going to come over to my scores JSX, and I'm going to replace that JSX that's being returned with our actual content from it. And if I just save this, and then we toggle back over to our component, you can see that it's actually rendering something nicely in there. So it's pulling that in there, and that's our first step towards actually making it all work. Now we need to replace, just like we did in the other class, or in the other components, the reference to class, because that's a reserved JavaScript variable, and so we can't use that in our JSX. Instead, we'll use class name, which the Babel compiler, when it transpiles it, will turn it back into class. So we can save that. Come over here, refresh, everything still looks good. And so now what we want to do is actually, instead of all of that stuff that was happening over in our scores.js file, we want to pull that into our render function to actually, our component function to actually do all the same kind of things. So it was basically doing two main things. There was this load score that happened whenever the component opened, so right there. It would call this, and that would go off and do a fetch request to the back end to actually get the scores data and stick them in local storage and update that score variable right here and update display of scores by passing in the display score function, which would create all those elements and then inject them in order to manipulate the DOM. So we can do this using just basic JSX and coding changes. And we can do this, the loading of this, by using a useEffect hook to actually load that data asynchronously. So to make that happen, I'll just copy this over here right now, our load scores, and place this over in here. Not that we're going to use that code directly, but we're going to show you how I port this over to actually be a React component representation instead. So the first thing I need is a state variable on our component that will actually store the scores value. So I'm going to create that right now, just using the React useState hook, and I've got a state variable that I can put the scores into and a way to update those scores. And then instead of just calling this function, which I'd have to wait on in order to actually have it all load up and everything, I'm going to use an effect and basically rewrite that same code just using the useEffect hook. So if you look at this right here, what this is saying is that when this component loads up, it's going to register this hook, and this hook's going to fire whenever the component loads for the first time, because it has no dependencies on any other state variables. So it's only going to go the first time it actually gets. and it's going to make the fetch request, and then it's going to call the set scores function on here to actually inject that into there. And then I'll stick it in local storage. If it fails, it's just going to pull it out of local storage and set scores from whatever was in local storage. And that's basically the same code that it was doing down here. So now I can delete this old version, and I ported that functionality over, and I'm now oops, apparently I deleted a little too much. I lost my little header there. Let's undo here really fast. Figure out where I deleted a little too much. Oops, no. Maybe I didn't delete a little too much. I didn't insert it into the right place. So there you go. Yeah. I've got to move this code down into here, into our actual component. There we go, instead of at the top. Yeah, there you go. Okay, now I've got it right. I've got my component. I set the scores with our state variable whenever that use effect triggers, and that will update it. Okay, so the next part I need to do is dynamically generate the JSX that represents the table from those scores. So in our old code, we would do that using all of this manipulation of the DOM. In our new code, in our component, we can actually we can write a function which is dependent upon that state scores changing to actually generate an array of JSX. So I've got this just constant array of of JSX table rows that I'm going to do. And then if my scores variable has any length, and remember this is reactive, so this is going to change whenever this use effect actually changes, and it will re-render my function and call this back down in here again. So if there aren't any scores, it will just push in a single row that says be the first to score. If there are scores, then it's going to go through that array of entries in there, and it's going to push a new JSX table row into that array. And then I can just take that variable and reactively inject it into the body here by using the React curly brace syntax there to actually inject that row directly into it. And that's all I need in order to actually create new JSX to actually update this thing dynamically. It's similar to what was happening over here to dynamically create it, but I'm just using the JSX syntax, and I'm basing the triggering of that happening based upon whenever this state variable, the scores, gets updated to actually re-render this thing. What we actually need to do now is make it so that I can proxy across through our hot loading React server into our back end service that's actually running. And if I try and run that right now, it's going to conflict because this one's also listening on port 3000. So I need to stop this and instead set up our debugging environment so I can have my backend service running so I can actually go get those values. So the way you do that is you create a new file called env local in our root directory here, which will tell that debugging reloading HTTP server for React to actually open up and use a different port than 3000. So if I do env.local, env.local, and come in here and say I want port is equal to 3001 instead of the default port. Now when I run npm start, you'll see that it actually starts up on a different port. Now we're listening on port 3001 instead. The other thing that I have to change is tell it that when you get a request that you don't know what to do with, I want you to proxy it over to the HTTP server. So I can do that by just modifying the package.json file, coming in here and placing in this right here, which is a proxy request. So any requests you don't know how to handle, I want you to proxy them over to 3000. And the final step that I have to do to make this work is to start up our backend service. So you remember if I just push F5, that should launch my backend service. If I come over to the debug console, you can see that it's listening to port 3000 and everything's good there. So if I actually open up from my service directory, my index.js file, and I go to my endpoint that actually gets the scores and put a breakpoint on this, I need to actually restart my application so it will take effect of those requests. So I'm going to kill it. Just to show that it's been killed, I'm going to come over here and refresh and it's dead. So I'm going to do an npm start again, and that should reload it. Now these scores will come in here once they load, and you can see it's actually making requests over to the scores endpoint, and it's getting a 401, which is not an authorized error. Okay, so this is a problem. So we're not going to get our scores back from our endpoint until authorization works. So I can see that it's actually calling it. If we come up here to our secure router, which is checking our cookies, put a breakpoint on here and do a refresh again, you can see I'm actually now debugging my back end. So I can actually just relax this for right now. So if I stop debugging this and I just call next instead of checking for the authorization token, and then we can re-enable this once we get our authorization on our front end working. So I'll just call next and call that out there. I'll start debugging again. And now if I refresh, we should get our scores endpoint's going to get hit. It's going to return those scores from it. And we toggle back over here. Now I'm really loading from the back end all of those scores. You can see my endpoint's called there. I got a 200 response from it. And if I actually look at the data, it's actually coming back. So that enables us to actually debug in our production environment both our front end using React, which will be listening on port 3001, and then our back end, it's going to proxy request for that it doesn't know about over to our back end, which is listening on port 3000, which will then do all the requests. And that allows me to run both my back end just by pushing F5 and using Node.js to debug it, and also the hot reloading debugger, which is run by typing npx. So these errors are all from the previous one there, but now that's all working, so we're good. Okay, so that's how you do debugging, and we ported over our scores component, and we're actually having it rendering, and it's pulling that data straight from our back end and displaying it there by using the functionality which we implemented in our scores component to do on the first load, to go and fetch that scores and update our state variable for scores. And then every time that updates, we're going to detect that, and we're going to re-render our JSX based upon iterating through those scores, and then just pop that array of scores directly in there. So that demonstrates a lot, both debugging, starting up our back-end debugging, setting up our environment to actually do it, which was done by manipulating our package.json to have that proxy over to our backend, and also by injecting the env local one to tell it to use port 3001 instead of 3000. So I'm going to go ahead and shut that service down now at this point, and I'm actually going to stop this one here too, and we're ready to actually port our next component. So I'll close all these windows up here, and we'll get ready to go. Now, the next component we're going to do is our about component. So right now, and I'm going to start debugging by debugging our backend by just pushing F5, which is going to start up that backend. Now, if I do npm start, it's going to run, and we just look at those errors there, and there wasn't any. It was all happy. Everything's running great. And if we toggle back over here, our scores work. But if we go to our about page, then there's nothing actually running there yet. So we need to get that about working. So if we come back over here and we go to our about component, which is right here under about, and we see that we're just still displaying this standard one. So what we want to do is go back to our old code and go to our about component and do the same thing that we did with our previous component. So I can just go here and grab the main, because I don't care about the footers and headers anymore. That's all represented by the app component, which is the parent of this one. Copy that HTML there. And I'm going to go back down to my about component. Let's get this out of my way over here. Go back to my about component here, and I'm going to replace this with that. Just pop that in there like that. Okay, so that should do something, right? So if I go over here to my HTML, you can see it's actually displaying and rendering that there. And that's great. That's a great start. Our CSS, so if I actually go back to my about over here, I'll see that I have actually about CSS, so I need that too. So let's copy that file and bring it down into here and paste it into my about. So now I've got an about CSS, and then I just have to import it over on this side. So I can do an import that, And assuming that I did that right, we should be able to see that our component has actually changed. And yeah, so now I'm starting to get some of the styling that I expect, but I'm missing my two components, my two third-party endpoints that I want to call to display my picture and also to display my code. So in order to do that, I have to actually bring the JavaScript over from the backend, the old code. So if I come here, not the scores, but the about, my about JavaScript, you can see that that was done by calling two functions, a display picture and then a display quote. And then I just had this wrapper function for calling those things. And then I called those two things whenever this JavaScript is loaded up as part of the HTML load. So we don't want to do it that way. We want to make it so that it actually uses more proper JSX syntax. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to set some state variables, very similar to what I was doing before. So I'm going to have 3 of them that I'm going to bring over. And those state variables will represent different parts of our component. So the first is the image URL. I have to go and get that from our third-party service. And then once I have it, I can actually use it to render within it. The other one is the quote, so the text for quote. I'm going to initiate this to be just loading, so while it's actually requesting the quote service, it actually displays that text. And then I also need to know what the quote author is. So both of these two, the quotes are coming from my quote service, and my image URL is coming from my image service. Now to actually use this, I need to dynamically load these things. So I'm going to do that with the same kind of concept that we used over in the scores component. So I'm going to call React useEffect, and so this one's going to also happen only when it loads. So there's no dependency, it only runs this once when it loads. It's going to make 2 fetch requests. One that's going to go out and just ask for a random number generated page from our photo service. And then when that comes in, I'm going to pull in and I'm going to find the element that I want to actually inject this into. I'm going to set the width and height based upon the width and height of the element. So I'm pulling this in just so I know like how big I want to request the actual the width and height for it. So I'm going to create a URL that's going to then give me back, so using that data ID that was returned from the endpoint to tell which photo I'm asking for. I'm also going to specify the width and height based upon the width and height of the element that I'm going to inject into. And I'm going to say I want it to be grayscale. And then I'm going to set the state variable for that URL into here. So that allows that to be put in here. Now I'm not actually using that yet. And so if I want to actually use that URL variable, then I'm going to have to, after this actually gets called, so I'm not going to do this part yet. I'm going to comment out the one that actually gets the quote. I'm going to come down in here, and I'm going to add some more code to our component function. And this is going to say, okay, this is my image element that I'm injecting in here. And I only set this, I leave it empty, unless I actually have an image URL. So that gets set right here to that URL up in our useEffect hook. And I create an image file or an image element right here and inject that URL into it. And then I'm going to then set the value to that. So now I can just come down here, and in my JSX, I can actually just, within my picture box, I can just dynamically or reactively inject that image element there. And if it hasn't been retrieved yet, that's going to be empty and it won't show anything because that's the default state of it. If I do have a URL from it, then I got back from my third-party service, then I can create that element and inject it right into there. So that actually, hopefully, will work if we come over here to our file, and you can see, bam, it actually loaded that directly in there. And you can see it went out and it talked to, pick some photos, grab that URL, and then use that to inject it in. Okay, so that's great. Let's go ahead and do the other part, which is the quote. So in my same useEffect handler that only gets rendered when the component first loads, because I don't have any dependencies, I'm going to call my random quote thing. And that is going to set 2 things. It's going to set my quote and my quote author with the response data that comes back from it. And then it's just really easy to use that. I don't have to do any wangling to actually create the element because I've got the data directly there. So down in this right here, I can just create, before I was actually injecting all sorts of elements in here. So now I can just go ahead and replace that with the use of the quote and the quote author doing the reactive dynamically injecting of that data based upon those state elements that I defined above. So define the state up here, use effect to asynchronously load that data, set those two variables using that, and then display it within there using the reactive JSX syntax. If I come over here, you can see I've actually got my, my quote and also my quote author displayed there. So that's the about component. That looks like it's working great. So this is a good time to actually go ahead and go and commit your changes over here that you've actually made so that you've got a valid milestone for the next component to be ready to be added to that. So now I'm ready to do my next component, and the one we want to do is the authorization component, which right now is just stubbed out. We got scores working, we got about working, play's not working yet, but we need to do these two, our last ones. So to do that, I need to do for some groundwork. I want to be able to change my interface so that if I'm not logged in, I don't display the ability to play the game or see the scores, which will allow me to, like we went and changed our back end back here, to actually disable that. So now I can re-enable that so that it actually does enforce that you can't get the scores unless you're actually logged in. So I'm saving that. We need to restart our service so that actually gets brought in. Just to make sure I got that right. Yeah, there you go. And then the other thing I need to do is change the UI so that it can actually disable those menu options. So before I do that, I want to add a new class to our login functionality here. So I'm going to come here and do a new file, and we're going to call this authstate.js. And then I'm just going to create an enumeration basically in JavaScript. And this enumeration is going to have three different states. There's unknown for your authentication, you're authenticated, or you're not authenticated. And I'm going to use this as my state value to pass around to all my components so that I know whether or not they're authenticated. Okay, so now I can go back to my app.js. I'm missing an import here, which I need. So we haven't yet imported anything that uses React. That all happens everywhere else. So now I'm going to actually use React. So I'm going to save that there. And what I want to do first is create a state variable for my username so that I can track and retrieve what my actual username is. Okay, so that's that state variable there. And then based upon when that username changes, I want to have a second state variable which actually represents the authenticated state of that user using that new auth state thing that we just brought in. So I actually have to bring that in from that code file that we created so that I don't get an error on that. And then now I've got the ability to both track as state my username and also what the auth state of that user is. So now I just need a way to set what that auth state is. So if I come here and use another use effect, but this time I'm actually going to make it dependent upon the username. So whenever that username changes, this callback function is going to get called, and I'm going to update what the auth state is based upon the username. So I do that by just checking to make sure I actually have a valid, non-empty string there, and that it's not nullish, and that I'm going to call a fetch request to my backend to say, hey, give me any information about this user you have, and if that user is authenticated in the return result from that call, then I'm going to set my auth state to either authenticated or not authenticated. So that's going to call back and set this variable here. And that's everything I need to actually update the state of the user. But I'm getting some errors here because I'm not actually calling set username anywhere, and I'm also not calling auth state. So I need to actually use our auth state to control what options are actually displayed here. So I want to disable the play function, and I also want to disable the scores function. So in order to do that, I can actually put some just JSX JavaScript in here. So on my play, I can wrap that with a curly brace, which says this whole section now here is dependent upon whether or not the user is authenticated. So I'm going to put a brace around my code so that it knows that, around this code right here, so it knows that that is JS, or yeah, that is the JSX that I want to inject here. And I'm putting curly braces around it to know that that needs to be evaluated. So what this is saying is that if my auth state is equal to authenticated, that's true, then I'm going to return as a result everything between these parentheses, so that JSX into this position where it would be. So that's just gating whether or not that JSX actually gets injected based upon whether that is authenticated or not. And I want to do the exact same thing for also my scores. So my scores gets that, and I come down here, and I put my close parenthesis and my close curly brace on that. So now those are both totally optional elements for my code. And that's saved. I'm still getting one error, which is that user state is never actually enabled here. If I actually go over to my code now and refresh, you can see my menus are not being displayed because I'm not authenticated, right? That code's never getting triggered because my user state is never actually being updated. So we're going to update that in a bit here. But first, what I need to do is actually make that possible for me to actually log in and log out and all that other stuff. So I need to enhance my home or my login functionality here. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to change this from being just a simple route here, which just displays the login component, to actually display the login component with some parameters to it. So I'm going to change that route and paste in this one right here. And we'll reformat that. So it's got the same path, but now our element is specified as a login, and I'm passing in 3 parameters to it. I'm passing in the username, the auth state, and whether or not that auth when the auth state changes, that I want it to call back to me on this callback function and actually set my auth state and my username. Okay, so now I need to go and implement this login component to take those 3 different parameters to dynamically actually handle that. So I'm actually good and fine. Now I'm using all those variables, but now we're going to go and rewrite our login component. So I'm going to close this up, and I'm going to come over here and open up our login component. Now our login component is going to actually be dynamic. It's going to have 2 children, because remember, I want to display a different UI based upon whether or not the user is logged in. If they're not logged in, then I'm going to display the inputs to allow them to log in. If they are logged in, I'm just going to allow them the inputs to actually display the play. So our login component is going to actually have, I'm just going to pull in some code here to replace this, and then I'll walk you through what all this code does. So our login component imports its 2 children that it's going to create, and then it's also importing the authorization state. And then you can see those 3 parameters that I'm passing into it here: the user state, the username, and the auth change. And then within this, I'm actually going to optionally display whether or not it's welcome to Simon based upon if it's not equal to unknown. So if they're authorized or not authorized, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to display welcome. But if it hasn't gotten anything yet, then it's just going to display an empty space. If they are authenticated, then I'm going to display the authenticated child component, React component at this point. If they're not authenticated, then I'm going to display the unauthenticated child component. And I'm going to pass down all the proper parameters necessary for those components to actually work properly. So I'm going to pass in the username in both cases. I'm going to pass in a logout function in the authenticated case. And in the unauthenticated case, I'm going to add an onLogin, which actually updates the username and the authenticated state, which was passed in as a callback parameter here. So this is chaining up from the unauthenticated component into the login component, and then all the way up to the app component to pass that information back up the parent chain of what actually happened here. So now all we have to do is just implement the unauthenticated and the authenticated component, and everything should work fine. So we've got to go create those. So I'm going to go over here and create a new file, and I'm going to call this one the let's do the unauthenticated one first. Unauthenticated.jsx. And you can see I actually have a typo here. This needs to be match it. So unauthenticated is there. And hopefully I spelt that right. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So I can come over here and I can create my unauthenticated component. And this one here, I'm going to paste this in. It's got a little bit of logic to it. So I've got my top level component here, and it's going to reference a message dialog, which I'm going to use to display errors, and I'll create that in a second here, and that's what this is telling me, is I haven't implemented that yet. And then I'm going to have different state variables for the authentication. I'm going to have a set username, a set password, and a set display error. Those are my 3 state variables. And then I've got a login function, and I've got a create user function. And so when they actually push the button, I'm going to either do a create or a login. And all that's going to do is just call different endpoints. And so that's why I've kind of combined those there together, because the functionality is the same whether case you do. It just needs to call a different endpoint. So that endpoint is going to get passed in here. I'm going to make the fetch request to the back end, which actually attempts to either do the login or the create. And then based upon that response, I'm going to set in local storage the username, so I remember that's there. And then I'm going to set my property on login. I'm going to call that function that was passed as a parameter here, my onLogin function, as part of the component in the properties, and that will allow us to report back to my parent component that there's been a login and this is the user's name. Otherwise, if there's an error, like the status comes back as you're not authenticated or that password doesn't work, then I'm going to use that set display error to actually display an error actually happening. And that set display error is going to pop up that modal dialog to actually display the error. And so that works by what I'm doing is I'm setting a state variable to this string right here. Set display variable is set on my state here. Now if we actually look down at this modal dialog, this message dialog down here, it will only display a message if there actually is a display error to display. And then when you hide it, it will clear that state variable back to null, which will cause this dialog to disappear. So we got to bring in our message dialog code in order for that to work properly. So I'm going to create a login file here, a new file called message dialog. This is a new component that will display our message dialog, and I can bring that over here and just paste it in. This is just a really simple component. So it just has JSX that uses the bootstrap, and these are these React component classes I was telling you about to represent both the modal and the button. And so I can actually use a React bootstrap implementation to display that modal dialog, and it's going to show those properties that I pass into it that were provided here when we actually ran it. So that should work fine. Now we're just missing one more component error, which we need to have from our login. We don't have our authenticated piece here. So we need to create one more component, which is the new file for authenticated. And if I come over here and we grab that and paste it in, now I've got my authenticated component. It's much simpler than the unauthenticated one. All it does, it says, okay, I'm authenticated, that's great. I just need a hook to be able to report back to my parent component when I log out so that I can remove that and set the state back to a state where the user's not actually authenticated. So the JSX is really simple and displays the username. It has a button to play, it has a button to log out, and if you push log out, it calls log out, which fetches and tells our backend service that we're logging out, which will remove the token from the cookie. And then it calls the logout function, which will cause it to then clear everything out and return to our previous state. So with that saved, we're getting really close. We just don't have a style sheet because we actually had some styles for our authentication back over in here. So our login had this really simple style sheet here. So I want to just bring this over from our backend code and put it right in here in our login code. So we're going to do a new file of, this is our authenticated.css, because I was only using that here to display the color name, the person name in a different color. Come back over here, and that is referenced and brought in right here on that line. All right, so that's all the login functionality, and if I've done it all right, we should be able to come here, and you see that I have a username here already, so I'm going to push this and push password and do the login, and it shows me my username right there, and it's displaying that it's played or not, which is all great. And I can actually go and push the play button, and it will take me to the play page. If I go back home and do log out, it will clear that out. Notice my menu's dynamically adjust because my state has actually changed and that's no longer there, and I'm back to the state where I need to log in again. If I just log in again, then I'm all good. If I log out and create a new user, like rat, give it a good password and say create, then I'm going to be now a rat user instead of that. So that's all the login functionality to actually make it work. I realize that's a little bit complex. There's a lot of different moving things there, but if you look through the Simon code and basically reuse a lot of that same logic in your application, then it should work very nicely for you. So that's the login component. Now to do the play component, we just go over here to our JSX file, which is still this standard placeholder here, and we want to actually just bring in all of our code which actually does all the playing. So our HTML is in here, and once again it's pretty simple. It's just this stuff right in here, and so I can bring that over and put it in as is, but I'm going to take a shortcut here because I've already probably blown out your time that you got for this, and just bring in the conversion of this, because I've actually done quite a bit to make this have multiple different subcomponents within it. Like there's a game component, and then the game has players, and there's a Simon button, which also plays out from all of that. So instead of bringing that code over and showing you all the steps to do it, which hopefully by showing you the other three components, you've got a feel of like how you would do that, I'm going to come over to my play component here, and I'm just going to bring in a whole bunch of files that represent all of that functionality to convert it over. So I'm going to delete my play there and just bring in all of those here. So just to step you through what this code is actually doing, here's what our play component now looks like. So much more simple. I've just got a main component which has what styling I want on it, and then it has two subcomponents. One is to display the players, and the other one is to display who the actual the game itself. And then if you actually go look at the Simon game, you'll see that it has like all of the functionality that was previously in my game. So the JSX is pretty simple. It's got a game, it's got a button container, it's got all the classes for displaying those controls and everything, and then it's using the Bootstrap button React component to actually display that button there. There's one thing that I'm missing though, is that over in my app code, which is back over here, you'll notice that my play component is actually expecting some properties, which is the username that's going to pass down into the players and also into the game. So the game needs it so that it can store their score with their name, and the player needs it to display who's actually playing the game at the moment. So I need to make sure that that actually gets passed down when my route gets called here. And so if I actually go and pull that representation through, then my play line changes to be this instead. So I'm just passing as a property to my play component that username down there. Okay, so I kind of waved my hands at that. All that code just brought over. I've shown you how I've broken it up into two different subcomponents, and those subcomponents do some interesting things. So here's the players. You can see I've got a state event here for handling whether or not, so this does all the game notification stuff for handling all the WebSocket display, and that's basically what that's doing for the most part, is just hooking into that game notifier JavaScript, which is the same stuff that we had over in the Simon version of WebSocket, but it's allowing the interface to actually display those messages within there. So that one's pretty simple. If we go look at the other one, which we already kind of did, then you can see that that's just broken up into having a button and a game sub-element onto that to actually render the actual display. So in theory, we should actually be completely working at this point. So I can log in as rat, I can push that button, I can push play, and the game actually renders there. All right, I'm getting rid of that. And I can actually show you that the game is there. I can push reset, the game starts on up. I can go ahead and push the buttons and play the game. And then when I make a mistake, it's going to give me an error. Do the button dance. I can go over to my scores. And if I'd actually gotten a high score, which today it takes a lot of work to actually do. I would have been displayed there. My About box works. It's bringing in those third-party APIs to bring those in. My home works. I can log in and out. I've got a fully functional app. So that's everything you need to do at this point. On that last change to the component, I could just go over here and actually do my commit. There is one thing else that I want to point out to you, and that is that we need to make sure that our WebSocket works in our development environment when we're debugging the application. I showed you how to like set up the proxy through and how to make sure that the React HTTP server is running on port 3001 instead of 3000 so it doesn't conflict with the back end. But I also need to make sure that in my game notifier I do one other thing. So by default, the old code would have just taken whatever port was being listened on by the main thread, by the main application, and just used it. But because now we're actually having our front end listen on 3001 and our back end's on 3000, when we're debugging in our development environment, we need to make sure that it knows that you need to use 3000 to do WebSocket communication. So it just checks this environment, which the bundler will inject here when it transpiles the code and actually builds it when you're debugging. It will set it to development instead of production. So if we're not production, we want to set our port that we use for our WebSocket back to 3000. And that way it will actually create our WebSocket connection directly to the backend service instead of trying to go through the HTTP server that React is hosting, which then proxies through, because it won't proxy the WebSocket request. So you have to make that directly call through. And that's how you do it right there, is just by adding these 3 lines to your whatever WebSocket code you're using to actually make that pass through. And that's it. That's everything that you'd have to do in order to convert Simon WebSocket over to a React representation. Hope that's helpful for you. My best wishes to you, and I hope things go great.